Welcome, everyone. We'll be waiting 2 to 3 minutes to get started as a courtesy to those who are still in the middle of connecting. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for being part of our community. We have an interesting topic to cover today, but first, a few reminders. Please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the IM window. Be aware that your questions that you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your questions anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter them. We've had a large number of people register for this webinar. We're thrilled to see such interest, but it means that it may be impossible for us to respond to every single question in real time. We will do our best, and we have several dedicated people standing by just to answer questions, but I wanted to provide an additional mechanism to ensure everybody's questions get answered. If you'll visit aka.ms/AIPQ&A, you'll see a post dedicated to webinar questions. We'll be reviewing the question transcript after this webinar, and we'll post further answers there. If you're listening to this after the fact as a recording, that's also a great place to ask a question. So feel free to reply to that post with any questions that you have. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/AIP recordings. If for some reason you don't have access to the rest of the series, you can find it at aka.ms/AIP webinar. While you're there, please join our community by visiting aka.ms/security community. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews, requesting features, giving feedback, reviewing our product roadmaps, attending in-person events, or joining webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. We have some very useful content for you today. This is part 3 of a 6-part webinar series on Azure Information Protection, or AIP for short. Throughout the series, we'll be walking you through all the major aspects of functionality, showing you how to deploy and configure each part. Today's focus will be on classification and labeling taxonomy recommendations. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter and AIP expert. Shubha Prati is a senior program manager on our AIP team and part of what we call our Get to Production group. She helps our customers deploy and configure AIP, so she has deep expertise in this topic. With that, I'll hand it over to her. Shubha?
Hey everyone, welcome and thanks for joining our webinar. Today I will talk about classification and labeling taxonomy in Azure Information Protection. This is one of the first steps you will take as you are deploying Azure Information Protection in your organization. So when you are looking to deploy Azure Information Protection, the project itself has several phases. And these are discover. So first you would discover what type of data you have within the organization, whether it's credit card numbers, social security numbers, or other GDPR type data that's more important to you. You will find what data exists in your organization. And for a large part, that will drive your classification and labeling taxonomy. And once you define the classification taxonomy, the next step is to, and you start labeling your files, the next step is to add protection to these files. And once you've done all of that, the last step is monitoring the data that you do have, what has been classified and labeled, what's been protected, whether it's being shared internally or externally. And today we are going to focus on the second piece, which is classify and label. So we are going to talk about what document classification is, how you would define a classification taxonomy, what a label actually does, and how you would make this classification and labeling taxonomy easy and understandable for your users. So as we talk about classifying and labeling, so what exactly is document classification? So classification is the ability to determine how confidential your information is. So different sets of data you have are of different sensitivity in nature. For instance, files or emails that have credit card numbers may be more sensitive than a document that has just a project name. So you would want to be able to classify these separately. How do you actually classify documents? Or what's important in a classification taxonomy? The first thing that's important is that it's something that's easily understood by everyone across the organization. If a user looks at your classification taxonomy, it needs to be easy for them to understand so they can choose what to apply. So the naming and description of the classification of the label itself is very important. The second thing you would do, like I mentioned before, is once you identify the different sensitive information types in your organization, so we talked about the discovery phase earlier, and we have the AIP scanner, which can help you do that. So through that, you would identify what sensitive information types exist in your organization, and you could associate each of those sensitive information types that you have with a different confidentiality level. And that is how you would come up with a taxonomy. So that's classification. So what exactly is a label? The label itself is metadata that gets written into the document. And it travels with the document regardless of where it goes, whether it's on premises, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's inside the organization, or whether it's sent outside the organization. And the label sits in clear text. And why does this sit in clear text? Because a system such as a DLP engine can read it. So let's say you have a DLP engine that reads that a specific file is confidential. It can take further actions on it. It can say, I am not allowed to send anything outside of the company if it's marked confidential, and can block me from sending that. Or it can say anything that has a confidential label it needs to have protection applied before it can be sent out, so it can perform that action. So a protection action or a data governance action can be taken by systems such as a DLP engine based on the label. And again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. It's something that you can customize for your organization. So once you label a document, different systems in the company can perform different actions on it as you need. So what exactly is a taxonomy? In this example, you see there are 5 different levels of confidentiality available for the user to choose. At the top level, there's non-business, public, general, confidential, and highly confidential. This is the taxonomy that we use at Microsoft. So at the top level, there are 5, and we'll go over some of the descriptions of what each of these do a few slides down, but I just wanted to talk about the fact that there are 5 at the top level. And within some of these categories, you see that there are sub-labels. So for instance, under highly confidential, you see there are 3 sub-labels. One is Microsoft full-time employees and Microsoft Extended, which is full-time employees plus any vendors and contract employees. And then there's an any user. So at the top level, there are 5, and they're few enough in number that an information worker is not confused by looking at the number, but by looking at the sheer number of the labels. And anything that you want to be scoped under a specific label to be a sub-label, you can put under that. So the top level taxonomy, you want it to be small. And so how do you actually configure or create these labels? I'm going to jump into a quick demo to show you that. So there are 2 ways for you to configure your labels. One is through the Azure portal, through the Azure Information Protection Blade, and the other one is through the Security and Compliance Center in Office 365. So in this case here, this is the Azure portal. The way you get to the screen is you look for Azure Information Protection in the search bar once you log into portal.azure.com. And then you come to the Azure Information Protection page, and then you click on labels to get to this blade. So here you see I have some additional labels created, but by default you get a set of 5 labels. That's personal, public, general, confidential, and highly confidential. So you can use the default, or you can make changes here and set the fields that you need to set and give the names that you want to give. And there are several fields that you can configure here. So for instance, you can configure what the description should look like. And one of the things that we always tell customers is you want the description to be useful to the users. So the label name itself should be self-explanatory in a lot of cases. But in case they need additional information, the description, which shows up in the tooltip, can be very helpful in telling the user why they would use a specific label. There are other settings that you can configure. You can choose a color, and you can choose protection settings. So by default, there is no protection applied, but you can choose to apply protection. You can set visual markings such as headers, footers, and watermark. And these again are also configurable. The font and the colors and the text itself, all of that is configurable. And if you wanted to add automatic conditions, that is something that you would do here as well. So, but I want to focus on taxonomy in this session, so I'm going to go back to the slides once I talk about the Security and Compliance Center, but this is where you would configure different settings on labels. So the experience is similar in the Security and Compliance Center. The UI is somewhat different, but everything else is similar. You also get to make basically set all the similar settings here. You would have a name and description, and you could configure encryption if you wanted to, and content marking like the header, footer, and watermark. You could do that here as well. So the fields are similar. The UI is somewhat different. And I'm going to go back to the slides. All right, it helps to talk a little bit about the history of Azure Information Protection, or how this came about. So when we first started many years ago, the product was called Active Directory Rights Management Services. And at the time, the product did not do any classification or labeling. All it did was protection, and it was on premises. So you could go in, you could right click, you could go to a file in Office, and you could go in and actually add protection to it. So it would encrypt the file, and it would let you apply access control, and basically also help you do rights enforcement on specific files. But this was, again, only on premises and primarily just on Windows. And then the product came to the cloud, and it was called Azure Rights Management Services. At this point, it still was just an encryption technology, encryption, access control, and rights enforcement, but it did not do classification and labeling. And at one point, a few years ago, the team acquired Secure Islands, and at that point, the product morphed into Azure Information Protection. So at this point, the product started doing classification and labeling in addition to the encryption or the protection that it was doing before. And today, and when we started doing this, this was part of, again, it was part of the Azure portal, and you could add classification and labels to files and emails. And now this has become part of Microsoft Information Protection. So this is basically part of a suite of products that help you classify, label, and protect your data across different products, regardless of whether your data is in the cloud, whether it's on premises, no matter what device or platform it is on, you're able to apply labels and protection to them. So how do we label files? How do we classify and label files at Microsoft? This is a question I get from a lot of customers, so it would be useful to talk about it a little bit. So many years ago, Microsoft had this taxonomy for classifying SharePoint sites and documents as well. It was called LBI, MBI, and HBI. That stands for low business impact, medium business impact, and high business impact. I mean, while this was, it was basically short, it was just three levels of taxonomy. The hard part about this taxonomy was it was hard to decide what fell under what category. How would you classify a site as LBI? How would you know that something was medium business impact? What was high business impact? So the definitions themselves of what should be what was actually not very clear. So that led to a lot of confusion. And in the new world, with the new taxonomy, what Microsoft has now is personal, public, internal, confidential, and secret. So here in this case, this is where we started, and today it's switched over to non-business, public, general, confidential, and highly confidential. So note that earlier here we did not have different colors for the taxonomy, and now we've switched it to be different colors, and that makes it a lot easier for users to identify what label has been applied. In addition, you will see that internal has been switched to general. One of the reasons that was done was the internal classification actually did not have any protection applied, so the file could actually be shared externally. So the taxonomy itself, it was unclear what internal meant, And we've since gone and changed that to general, which has been better received by people in the company. So here are some descriptions for what these what each of these classification labels means, and this is really clear and tells you exactly what happens when you apply a certain label to a document or an email. So for instance, non-business tells you this is data that does not belong to Contoso. This means that the data is not encrypted, it cannot be tracked and revoked. Do not use non-business to classify any personal data which is collected by or which belongs to Contoso. Such content should be classified as either confidential or highly confidential. So in this case, the instruction to the user is very clear. It says non-business is data that does not belong to the company. This means that it's not encrypted, you cannot track or revoke it. And it also tells the user in what case they should not be using non-business. So the guidance to the user is very clear on what label should be used when. If you look at some of these other labels, they also have very clear descriptions of when they should be used and when they shouldn't. So for instance, look at the difference between general and public. So in the general case, it says to be used for business data, which is not meant for public consumption. But you can share this with internal employees, business guests, or external partners. And it's also very clear that the data is not encrypted. And it also tells you that this is actually the default label. So if a file is created, by default, the general label is applied. In case there's automatic labeling configured and a user, for instance, enters a credit card number and that triggers something, that's automatically going to be changed. Or the user can go in and change the classification as they choose. But if you look at the public case, it says this is to be used for business data that is approved for public consumption. So the guidance to the user needs to be really clear on when they should use what labels. And a user should very easily be able to order these and say, going from non-business to highly confidential, we're going from the least sensitive to the most sensitive data. And it needs to be very clear and distinct about what labels fall where. And as long as the users are able to tell that or able to understand that, then the labeling taxonomy is successful. Here are some examples of classifications and labels that some of our customers have used and found that they actually make sense for them. So in the first case, they use L1, L2, L3, L4, which is great if you want to have no ambiguity as to what the ordering of the labels are, as to what the ordering is. So in this case, you know that L1 is the least restrictive and L4 is the most confidential and therefore most restrictive. Some of the others here, like public, internal, confidential, secret, very clear as to what the least restrictive is and what the most is and what fall in the middle. Similarly, you look at some of these others, public, internal, confidential, and internal, confidential, secret. They're all the one thing that's common among all of these is that there's clarity about what is the least sensitive and what is the most sensitive and what falls in between. So in terms of best practices, so like I said before, the classification taxonomy needs to identify how confidential the information is. And based on what the confidentiality is, you can decide at a later point whether or not you want to apply any protection, and if so, what that level of protection should be. So the taxonomy itself, like I also said before, is that everyone in the company needs to be able to order from what's least restrictive to most restrictive without any doubt. If you're not able to do that, then that means you need to go back and change the taxonomy that you have to make it more clear. So we talked about the internal label at Microsoft. And the problem with internal was that the information was not encrypted. So the label internal did not make sense in this case. What we really wanted to say was that this needs to be general. The description is the same, but there is no expectation that this data is only accessible to internal users. And since there is no restriction as such, it should not be called internal. So yeah, to recap again, identify the confidentiality level of the data that is being classified, make sure that everyone in the organization is able to order all of this data from least restrictive to most restrictive, and make sure that there's clarity as to what the label's name is and what it is doing. And, we sometimes recommend a taxonomy that is different from what is already approved in your organization. When we go to companies, sometimes they already have classification taxonomy that they're using, and it's something that's been approved by the leadership. It's something that's been approved by leadership, and it's also something that end users are already aware of and are used to using. In that case, it's okay to configure the current approved taxonomy, use what you already have in AIP, and then you can collect feedback. If you want feedback on whether that's working, whether users are mislabeling, etc., you get that feedback, and if you need to change it at a later point, you can go in and change it. So if you have taxonomy in the organization you're already using, continuing to use that is definitely advised. And if you don't currently have a classification taxonomy, use the default recommendation that comes with the product that we just looked at earlier. And that's the fastest way to get started. You don't have to worry about whether the descriptions make sense. You don't have to worry about localizing those. You can just go in and directly use the 5 that are available there. And that's what we recommend if you don't already have anything set. So the other policy setting is about default labels. It's advised to use a default label for everything in the organization, and general is actually a good choice in that case if you're using the default label names. It's the classification that sits in the middle, and it is not very highly restrictive. It's something that can be shared internally and as needed with external users as well. So you're not necessarily restricting your end users a whole lot. You're letting them, you're basically telling them it's general. You can share it if you want internally or externally. So users that they share it with are not dead-ended. The other setting that you also have is allowing the end user to set a lower classification label. So let's say a document was classified automatically as highly confidential. Let's say it had a credit card number and it was classified as highly confidential. But the credit card number that was in there was something that the team is using for testing. So it's not really a highly confidential document. It's just these are test numbers that you're using, and you need to be able to share it more generally within the company and with partners. So you can choose to allow your users to change the classification or to remove a label or to remove protection. And one of the other things you can do is if they change a classification label, then they are prompted to provide a justification. So if they change it from highly confidential to confidential or general, they will be required to tell you why they're doing that. And the justification that they provide is also logged. It's logged, and the admin can see that someone had changed the classification and why it was changed. One of the other things to make sure of is to have end user training materials And this is something our team can help with as well. If you need any training materials, we have some templates that you can use. These include posters that you can put outside of elevators, etc. And it also includes email templates that you can send out to your users describing your classification taxonomy and how a user should choose the right labels. The important thing to also note here is that if you find that the amount of training you need is very extensive, and you're having to basically train users a whole lot to be able to use these labels, one of the implications of that might be that the policy, that the classification taxonomy that you're using is more complex than it needs to be, and that might be something to evaluate. And user awareness. So this is one of the materials that I was talking about. You basically have a class, you're talking about what the classification taxonomy is, and in this case you're telling them that non-business, highly confidential, general, and public is the taxonomy you're using. And notice that the label colors are also indicated here. And you can also give them additional links to be able to go ahead and read more about these labels. For instance, your poster might only have the label names, but you could provide them additional links for descriptions or additional training if you created any sort of videos, or if you have created training material additionally, that is something that you could also provide. In addition, one of the resources that I wanted to talk about was the AIP Deployment Acceleration Guide. It's available at aka.ms/AIP-DAG. This is something that the team created very recently, so it's very current and up to date. And it has a lot of guidance on how you can choose your labeling and classification taxonomy, and how users would, and what kind of materials you would need. In addition to just the taxonomy for labeling and classification, it also helps you plan your entire AIP deployment. What you should start with, for instance, you're starting with discovery, how you can do that using our tools. And once you're done with the discovery piece, how do you move on to actually creating labels from what you discovered? And after that, what you would add for protection, whether or what labels do you need to configure protection on. It's not on every label, it would be on just a few, and the document will outline how you would do that. And finally, how you would also monitor any of the data that you have labeled, classified, and protected. In addition, there are also end user materials. The end user materials include, some of the things we just looked at, which is these posters. Like I said, in addition, they include other materials like email templates and descriptions that you can use, default descriptions you can use for your labels, etc. So very useful material there that you can use for as you're deploying AIP in your organization. So that was it for the materials that for the presentation that I had, but happy to take any questions that were asked and not yet answered.
Great, thank you, Shubha. Let me read you back one here. It says, why is a default general classification better than not having a default? It seems to dilute the efficacy of prompting the user to set a classification on send or save, which in turn increases the risk that users won't properly classify more sensitive data.
That's a good point. So different organizations choose a different strategy in this case, and At Microsoft, we have chosen to use general because it is better to have a classification, a default classification than none at all. But there are organizations that will, you can choose to force your user to actually apply a classification instead. So I think it depends on the use case and on the organization. Definitely different organizations lean towards, there's no one size fits all, but at Microsoft, we've chosen to use general.
Okay, great. For the policy setting that has showing the AIP bar, would this be taken as a global policy or a custom policy?
Can you repeat that, Ryan?
Sure. Is the setting that configures whether you show the AIP bar on a document, is that a global policy setting or custom policy setting?
So the setting that tells you whether to show this bar?
Yes.
So whether to show this bar is it's basically a global setting when the bar either shows up or not for everyone. Was the question whether you could scope it to certain users?
I think so. I think that's how I interpret the question, is whether it was purely global or can you configure it just for certain users?
No, so basically, if the you can choose to, whether the question is whether you're trying to have the app, if the app is installed on, or if the client is installed on a specific machine, the setting will basically let you choose whether to show the bar or not for everyone. That is not something that you would scope to specific users.
But allow me to jump in. You can scope it to specific, like we can put that property, the advanced property, to show or hide the bar as part of a scope policy. It's not a commonly followed strategy since you either want the bar or not. But in theory, in principle, you can put it on a scope policy.
Great, thanks for clarifying, Enrique.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Okay, let's see here. Can you establish a predetermined classification for a specific group of users? Okay, I think that's really what you just answered there. Another version of that question. What are the recommendations on where to create labels? Does it matter? Are both SCC and Azure pointing to the same configuration? So can you update both?
So that's a really good question. So the AIP portal in Azure has existed for quite some time, and the Security and Compliance Center is fairly new. We announced that at Ignite. So essentially, if you are an organization that has already created labels in the Azure portal and are using that, there is a one-click migration process to take your labels over to the Security and Compliance Center. And once you do that, the labels sit in the same store. You do not have to recreate labels once you migrate them. So there are a few interesting things. If you're deploying today, there are a few interesting considerations because the two sets are not at 100% parity. So if you're using the AIP scanner, for instance, today, you would need your labels to be in the AIP portal in Azure. Again, that is something that is going to change in the coming months. All of this functionality will become available in the Security and Compliance Center. The other thing is, if you are using, if you want to use your labels on Mac, iOS, and Android, you will not be able to do it if your labels are just in the AIP portal. They will need to be in the Security and Compliance Center for you to be able to use the labels there. So so we have documentation on what the migration process is and what the difference in features is. In general, so once all is said and done, everything will be available in the Security and Compliance Center. But as of today, if you're starting today, there are some considerations to be made, and the migration portal, the migration documentation itself can talk about that. If you're starting afresh and you don't have any labels created, and what you're essentially looking to do is evaluate the functionality, and you're willing to deploy a preview client, then you can start directly in the Security and Compliance Center. But if you're deploying today in a production client and you want to use the scanner, then the recommendation is to use the AIP portal.
Okay, great, thank you. Can the scanner in AIP be configured to scan SPO sites manually and in an audit mode so you can see what the impact will be?
Yeah, so the question is whether you can use the AIP scanner on SharePoint sites, correct, in discovery mode. Yes, the answer is yes. You can use the AIP scanner on SharePoint on-premises sites. These would have to be SharePoint 2010 with an extended support contract, or a SharePoint 2013 or a SharePoint 2016 server. You can configure the AIP scanner to run either in discovery mode or in enforce mode. So I think your question was about discovery. So yes, you can configure that, and the logs will tell you what type of data was found.
Okay, great. How do you address the challenges of external recipients not being able to open encrypted content? Internal users too quickly jump to the conclusion that AIP doesn't work.
In a lot of cases, this has now been resolved. The issues that we had with external users not being able to open content aren't as prevalent as they used to be. So in case, and I'm going to address this question in two parts because there are two interpretations really. So if you use, for instance, Office 365 message encryption today, which uses AIP, basically any recipient will be able to open the file, open the email, and the promise is that the user is never dead-ended, regardless of what email address they have, whether it's Gmail or if they have something that they always have the one-time password option as well. Similarly with documents, a lot of those barriers have been broken. Now, but if the question is that there was a protection policy applied to the file, and that was internal only, and that was sent out to an external user, you're right. In that case, the user will not be able to open it. But in this case, that was the experience that was intended. The barriers for a valid document not an external user not being able to read something that was originally intended for them is that's not really as much of a concern anymore as it used to be in the past. In a lot of cases, if they're not supposed to read it, then that's when they won't.
Okay, thank you. MCAS has a 1 million character limit for scanning a file. Does AIP Scanner have the same limit?
That is a great question that unfortunately I am not aware of the answer. If anyone else on the call does, then.
Yes, I can answer to that. No, the AIP scanner doesn't have that limit. It can scan, I think, files up to something like multiple gigabytes. Can't remember the exact number, but very big files. One clarification about MCAS, which is something I recently learned, so I want to mention it, is that limit in number of bytes is only applicable to the text bytes, the data that is actually being scanned. So if you have a big file, like a 20 megabyte file that includes a lot of images, the images do not count towards that limit. So it's very rare that you will have a file that hits a limit. And I think they increased recently the limit to something like 10 megabytes, so it's no longer 1 megabyte. But even then, it's 10 megabytes of text, in addition to any images that might be in the file that do not get scanned. So in MCAS, the limit is much bigger than is usually perceived. And in the scanner, there is no limit, or no practical limit anyway. One detail is that in the scanner, you may be limited by the amount of memory in the scanner server. So if you have, let's say, 10 gigabytes of RAM and you are scanning with 10 threads, you may hit the limit of 1 gigabyte, but not an arbitrary limit. It's just the limit of the resources on the machine that you're using to scan.
Great, thank you, Enrique. When a user utilizes AIP Windows Apps custom permissions, does it use the user's key or an organization's key chosen inside the AIP console? In other words, can a global admin read or decrypt that file?
Yeah, so the global admin, yes, the global admin can decrypt essentially any file, and this permission is called, this user that can decrypt anything is called a super user. And the reason this super user permission is available is in case, let's say somebody leaves the organization and you want to be able to decrypt all the files that they have that are protected to them. So yes, there is a user that can decrypt any information in the organization, regardless of who has protected it.
Great. What licensing is required for AIP Scanner?
So the AIP Scanner today, it runs in two modes. It runs in the discovery mode and it can run in the enforcement mode. So to be able to run the AIP Scanner in discovery mode, where it's going to run these scans and produce reports for you and tells you what type of data it found, but it doesn't actually apply any of the labels, you need AIP P1. That's also available as part of EMS E3. So if you want the AIP scanner to actually enforce the labeling and apply the labels and the protection, then you would need AIP P2, which is also available through E5.
Okay, thank you. Can we apply the protection to just a particular group of users?
Sorry, I lost you for a second there. Can you apply protection to a particular group of users?
Yes.
Yeah, so when you are configuring a label, let me see if I can pull up the UI as well, that might just be easier. When you're configuring a label, you can essentially say who you want the protection to be applied to. So in this case, for instance, when I say set permissions and I can add users here, so I can add specific users or specific groups here. So I can add through a list, I can browse through a directory, or I can just enter the group email. So yes, you're right. You can configure it to be a specific user or a specific group. And in addition, you can also configure the rights that they will have.
Okay, great. Do we have any plans around SharePoint 2019?
SharePoint 2019, there are no specific features that are new features that are being built specifically for on-premises SharePoint. There are features that we're building, but that will be specific to SharePoint Online.
Okay, great. I'm going to give another minute here for additional questions. While we're doing that, I'm going to post a few links here. We asked where people can find recordings and slide decks. We've got them posted there at aka.ms/AIP recordings. If for some reason you don't have the rest of this series, you can find that here, which is aka.ms/AIP webinar. As we mentioned earlier, if we somehow missed your question, or get the overflow questions area is aka.ms/AIP. And if you have not yet joined our community where you can find out about webinars like this, please go to aka.ms/community. I've got another question here. I recommend turning the super user feature off until needed and use at least 4 to 6 eyes on an organizational process when tuning it, so we can also monitor this or see. More of a comment there, but thank you for that piece of advice. We appreciate it. We'll give like 1 more minute here for any additional questions. Can you clarify the comment that iOS and Android can only use AIP if the labels are SCC? Is that to view, consume, or to set, or both?
So the question is clarify what you can do with iOS and Android, whether the labels have to be in SEC. So if you want to apply a label, or you want to, if you basically want to apply a label on an iOS or Android device, you will need to use you'll need to have your labels configured in the SEC. If you are just trying to open a protected document, or if you're trying to just view a labeled document, then you don't need the labels to be in SEC. It's only if you're trying to apply the labels that you need them to be in the SEC for iOS, Android, and Mac.
Okay, perfect, thanks. Is it possible to have multiple AIP scanners using the same SQL instance?
Yes, it is possible to configure multiple AIP scanners to use the same SQL instance.
Great. For information that is considered personally identifiable information, PII, what is the recommendation if you need it searchable internally but protected when it's external to the organization?
So the question is, you have PII, and if it is, and you want it to be searchable, but when it's sent outside, you want some sort of protection to be applied. So it would also depend on where the content will reside internally, whether if it's in SharePoint Online or if it's in Box, etc. So the recommendation would be then to apply some sort of, if it's something that can be shared internally within the organization, and you want your users, anybody in the company, to be able to search on it, the one recommendation would be to not apply any protection when it is in the organization. You could call it something such as PII, or it could be something you call confidential, for instance. But what the recommendation would be to have a DLP system, or even configure it in MCAS to say that when this document that's configured confidential is leaving or is being shared externally, then that's when you would go in and apply the protection on it, and don't apply any protection internally.
By the way, in the next webinar, we will discuss protection in more detail, and we will cover these use cases in quite a bit of detail.
Great, thank you. So this is more of a comment here. It would be great to make the Azure Information Protection Deployment Guide more like the Azure AD Identity Deployment Guides. And they give a link to the ones there on GitHub. So great, thank you. We'll take that feedback and look into that. Another point of feedback here, in our testing, MCAS failed when we selected all 90+ rules. Is AIP Scanner good with that, and can we have an AND operator for the rules?
So sorry, I missed the last part when MCAS failed, because when we had applied. When did MCAS fail? It
applied when they or it failed when they applied all of the 90+ rules. So then when they basically said apply all. Okay. It failed with, I mean, it'd be interesting to understand how when they say failed, it just failed to run. That's what it sounded like. So that shouldn't really be a limitation. And so with the AND operator, that is something that's not available through the Azure portal, but it is available in the Security and Compliance Center. So once the AIP scanner starts working with the SEC, which is going to be very soon now, you will be able to use AND operators there as well. Is there a data classification policy template available?
So I'm assuming the ask is that you would like a default or some sort of a default recommendation. So the default recommendation for a classification taxonomy is what you actually get when you first go to Azure Information Protection in the portal. Basically, whatever's available there, that is the default. And if you as an organization don't have a taxonomy yet, that's what we recommend that you start using. So whatever's available as soon as you log in.
Okay, great. If someone has a user, only one user with an AIP license, can all of the other users in the org see the labels that that user applies?
Yes, so the licensing that you're talking about is for someone to be able to actually go ahead and label the document, and the answer is yes, everyone else will be able to see whatever label was applied on the document, and if it's protected, then that policy would apply as well.
Okay, great. Is SharePoint 2019 supported? As when discussed, it is always to exclude AIP. Oh, sorry, sense this question here. Not quite sure how to interpret that one.
I think the question is, we normally don't talk about SharePoint 2019. We don't mention it in the coverage, but SharePoint 2019 is for all intents and purposes the same as 2016 when it comes to AIP.
Okay, gotcha. Great, thanks for clarifying, Enrique. Do we have intrinsic cloud super user privileges for example for search indexing?
So today, if your documents are protected beforehand and they are uploaded to a SharePoint site or a library, search and indexing will not work on those documents. That is something that the SharePoint team is working on, and once that work is done, search and indexing will start working on protected documents as well. The alternative to that today, since search and indexing doesn't work at this point, is to actually upload the documents with just a label but not with protection, and have MCAS be configured such that when the document leaves SharePoint, that's when the protection is applied. So that way search and indexing can continue.
If I might add to that answer, there was another aspect of the question is if it has intrinsic super user privileges to do that. As Shubha said, that functionality is not there today, but we already have it built, and we're testing it internally at Microsoft, and that uses intrinsic super user privileges, so you don't have to grant it super user privileges. So it's safe to assume that when it ships, that will be the case, and you won't need to grant it super user privileges because it will be embedded into the service.
Great. When users downgrade a label and provide a reason, is the event stored? The event is stored locally on the event viewer of the PC. Is there a plan to have it stored in the Security and Compliance Center and be reportable?
Yes. So the goal is eventually that it'll be available through the reports that are available online.
Okay, great. Would AIP scanner be able to label IRM-enabled SP on-premise library items?
So the SharePoint library is IRM enabled. I think that I think it would be. Enrique, do you have an answer?
Yeah, it's a subtle thing. So you can label files that are placed in a SharePoint IRM library, but the protection that SharePoint will apply does not consider whether the file is labeled or how it's labeled. So it's basically you're labeling, but in the end you end up with protection that is not related to the label that you have.
Okay, great. I think we've addressed most of the questions here, and we are about at the limit of our time. So I want to say thank you to Enrique, Kevin, Martin, and Raphael for being online to answer questions. And most of all, of course, thanks to Shubha for a fascinating presentation. And thanks to all of you for joining us. This was only part 3 in a 6-part series, so we hope you will continue to join us for the rest of it. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you, everyone.